Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar on death. This version is a condensed version of a series of 4 webinars presented in 2016 to the students of esoteric healing. So we tried to mention the points that are the most salient, but we apologize if not all of what Master DK has presented on death will be presented today, because we cannot condense all of it in about 1 hour's of presentation. But before we start, let us link up as a group by sending a ray of radiant light of love to the ajna of all of our group members. So raise your consciousness as high as you can. Endeavor then to hold steady, holding the mind unwaveringly in the light, realizing that on DK's part he too is standing firm, pouring out upon us his love and strength, and striving to raise us to a higher state of consciousness. Visualize then before us a disk of indigo blue light, of a deep electric blue. And imagine DK standing right in the center of that disk, waiting. And now see a band of golden light between us and the disk, gradually shortening, thus bringing us closer together, slowly and steadily, until we enter into the heart of the blue disk. And now let us sound a blue Om. We are told by Master DK that we need to study the subject of death with care, so that the theme of death can take a more sane shape in our mind. And we need to seek to arrive at a new slant upon that subject of death, and so that we can see lore and purpose and the beauty of intention in what has been in the past, or still now, a terror and a major fear. The task of all healing groups is to prepare human beings for what we should regard as the restorative aspect of death, and thus give to that dreaded enemy of mankind a new and happier significance. Healing groups must prepare to deal with this basic condition of all living, and is a major part of our work will be the elucidating of the principle of death. So how should we then define death? There is a variety of ways of looking at the subject, and we will take one aspect at a time. Firstly, death as the restorative process. Death in itself is a work of restitution. It involves the work of rendering back of substance to the three world of substance, and doing it willingly and gladly. But it also involves the restoration of the human soul to the soul from where it emanates, and doing this in the joy of reabsorption with the overself. So we must all learn to look upon death as an act of restitution in both ways. And if we can use an analogy, it's very much like an actor who, when playing a role, borrows a costume, but gladly returns it to the costume department at the end of the play, and then picks up his or her normal life. So too, the soul gladly lets go of its physical vehicle to be reabsorbed in the reservoir of elements, and is joyfully restored back to its source. Another way of looking at it is death as the end product of a fulfilled purpose. The aim of each life, whether it's human, planetary, or logoic, should be the effecting and the carrying out of a definite purpose. Now, this purpose is the development of a more adequate form for the use of spirit. And when this purpose is achieved, then the indweller turns his attention away and the form disintegrates, having served his need. And a very important definition of death is freedom from form life. Just like the bird can be freed from its cage, so too the soul is freed from the imprisonment of his three bodies, or from form. Death and disease as liberating factors. So we need to look at disease as a liberating factor that allows death then to take place, so as to allow the soul to escape from its imprisonment. But death and disease must be recognized as liberating factors when they come as the result of right timing by the soul. If only we could imagine the change in our consciousness when death comes to be regarded as an act of simple and conscious relinquishing of form, temporarily taken for two specific objectives. One, to gain control in the three worlds. But two, and most importantly, is to give the opportunity to the substance of the forms, thus stolen or borrowed or rightly appropriated according to the stage of evolution, to reach a higher point of perfection through the impact of life upon it via the soul. Now these are significant thoughts, friends, if we can remember that definition of death. Another way of looking at it is the soul's attention being turned away from the form. Now, the physical form is an aggregate of atoms built into organisms and then finally into a coherent body. And this body is held together by the will of the soul. Withdraw that will on its own plane, or let the soul's eye turn in another direction. And in this present cycle, disease and death will inevitably supervene. And a very important definition too here is the processes of abstraction are connected with a life aspect, and they are set in motion by an act of the spiritual will. Death, therefore, is in reality a means of abstracting the life principle informed by consciousness from the form of the bodies in the three worlds. So the discharge and directed and focused will is so magnetic in quality that it draws to itself the life of the other centers, the other chakras, bringing about the dissolution of the form and therefore the release of life. Another way of looking at it is the soul's power to offset the attractive power of matter. Under the law of attraction, the soul, at the close of a life cycle and with full intention, exerts its attractive power in such a manner that it offsets the attractive power inherent in matter itself. And death as a process of at-one-ment. We witness this phenomenon of at-one-ment every moment in nature. It's even more evident each year during autumn, where the life force is released from the form, which then just disintegrates and is reabsorbed in the vast reservoir of substance. So death releases the individualized life into a less cramped and confined existence, and eventually into the life of universality. And this, Master D.K. tells us, is a point of inexpressible bliss. And now, what does death mean for the soul? The eternal pilgrim of his own free will and accord chooses occultly to die and takes a body or a series of bodies in order to raise or elevate the lives of the form nature which he embodied. So death for the soul is really the taking of a form and the immersion of the life in the form. And in the process of doing so, that soul himself dies. For a free soul, death and the taking of a form and the consequent immersion of the life in the form are synonymous. But death is an entrance into fuller life. This is a freedom from the handicaps of the fleshy vehicle. So from the soul's point of view, it is not a death. It is only for us, in terms of the human being, that we consider death as the end. But for the soul, it's an entrance into fuller life. So I will conclude this section with a Buddhist saying. Yesterday is a memory. Tomorrow is a mystery. Today is a gift, which is why it is called the present. What the caterpillar perceives is the end, to the butterfly is just the beginning. Everything that has a beginning has an ending. Make your peace with that, and all will be well. So now let's consider the death process from an even higher perspective. Is the death process only confined to our human life? Well, the death process, as the withdrawal of life, is the same in men as it is in the planetary logos or the solar logos. That withdrawal of the life from the etheric vehicle, whether it's human, planetary or logoic, is exactly the same. And the consequences similar. Now let's go even further. This great law of death, which governs in such potency in our three worlds, is a reflection of a cosmic purpose, which governs the cosmic etheric planes of our solar system, the cosmic astral plane, as well as the cosmic mental plane. So it is way beyond our little human life. This death-dealing energy emanates as an expression of the life principle of that greater life, the cosmic logos, of whom our solar logos is the heart center. Just like the planetary or the solar logos takes a physical form, a planet or a solar system, under the law of sacrifice for a specific objective, which are to give opportunity to the substance of the forms thus stolen or borrowed or rightly appropriated according to the stage of evolution, to reach a higher point of perfection through the impact upon it via the soul. So too, the soul repeats the same process of taking a body of manifestation for the very same objective. And DK tells us to think and ponder on these thoughts as they are significant, because we can see that death is not just confined to our human life, but it goes way, way beyond us. And under the law of sacrifice, the first law of the solar angel too descends into matter, manifests through form, takes a body, expands the consciousness through the process of incarnation. And for that solar angel, all these processes are death. So they choose to die, and in dying lived, we are told. And through their sacrifice, matter is lifted up into heaven. So death is a great planetary ritual that governs our planetary life. DK tells us, could you but see the etheric world as those on the inner side of life experience and see it, you would see going on and ceaselessly and without any pause the great planetary act of restitution. The withering of a flower, the death from old age in an animal or a tree, and the many diseases of the human being are all brought about by the pull of the powerful life of the planet. It is an aspect of the law of return which governs the relation of a unit of life in form to its emanating source. Dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return, is the occult statement. And what's man's major obstacle? In spite of the progress made, man's morbid and dark attitude to death still remains to be changed to a more sane and wholesome one, and fear being the basic obstacle. And that fear of surviving is only found in the human kingdom. Because man is so identified with his physical body that the death of the physical body equates to dissolution and a non-existence of the I, of the self as well. So we are told that only that fear of survival is only found in the human kingdom, but very faintly in the animal kingdom is that reaction to fear found. And that's because the fear of health, the imposition of penalties, usually out of all proportions to the errors of a lifetime, the terrors imposed by an angry God. This teaching about hell is a remainder of the sadistic turn which was given to the thinking of the Christian Church in the Middle Ages, and to the erroneous teaching to be found in the Old Testament about Jehovah, the tribal God of the Jews. So we've been brainwashed to think that there is a hell, and there is a heaven, and there is a purgatory. But there is no angry God, no hell, and no vicarious atonement. There is only a great principle of love animating the whole universe. There is the presence of the Christ indicating to humanity the fact of life, the fact of the soul, and that we are saved by the livingness of that soul. After death, man finds on the other side of the veil those whom he knows, who have been connected with him in his physical life. And he's never alone, as human beings understand loneliness. But if people knew more, birth would be the experience that they would dread, not death. For birth established the soul in the true prison, and physical death is only the first step towards liberation. The loneliness which eventuates after death, when the man finds himself without a physical vehicle, is nothing compared to the loneliness of birth. For at birth, the soul finds itself in new surroundings, immersed in a body that is at first totally incompetent to take care of itself or to establish intelligent contact with surrounding conditions for a long period of time. So birth established the soul in the true prison, and physical death is only the first step towards liberation from imprisonment. So what is then the solution to man's fear of death? Law and rebirth, law of death and law of rebirth are two great planetary activities. Because if death is a great planetary activity, so must be the opposite. In all kingdoms, but here let's not confuse the law of rebirth with the law of the transmigration of souls. People frequently believe that the law of rebirth signifies the passing of human beings into bodies of animals or lower forms of life. This is not the case. As the life of God progresses onwards through form after form, that life in the subhuman kingdoms of nature proceeds progressively from mineral forms into vegetable forms, and from these vegetable forms into animal forms. And the life of God passes then into the human kingdom and becomes subject to the law of rebirth, not the law of transmigration. So who rebirths? We are told that throughout the universe, it is the soul which is the conscious, sensitive theme of the divine plan. The entire work of the evolutionary process is the great unfolding revelation of the soul of God. From the anima mundi through to the animal soul, then to the human soul and the divine soul. The law of rebirth is initiated from the soul plane. And a critical point here is that souls incarnate in groups, cyclically and under law, and in order to achieve right relations with God and with their fellow men. It is the soul who descends into matter and takes on vehicles of form. Under the law of magnetic control on the Buddhic plane, under the impress of the monad and the spiritual triad, the force of evolution drives the soul through a series of cycle of rebirths in the form, until those forms are perfect expressions of the indwelling spiritual consciousness and become adequate vehicles for spirit. And once this goal achieved, it is then reunited with its own kind. So conclusion, therefore, for this section, the hope of the future and the hope of our release from this ill-founded fear lies in the shifting of our emphasis to the fact of the eternal soul and the necessity of that soul to live spiritually, constructively, and divinely within the material vehicles. And now let's look a little bit more closely at death and consciousness. Death is really a matter of consciousness. One moment we are conscious on the physical plane, and a moment later we have withdrawn into another plane and are actively conscious there. We have died many, many times, and we shall die again and again. And as long as our consciousness is identified with the form aspect, death will hold for us its ancient terror. The process of death and sleep are identical. We forget that every night in the hours of sleep, we die to the physical plane, but we are alive and functioning on the other side of the veil, somewhere else but the physical plane. But we can't remember or bring back into the physical brain consciousness the recollection of that passing out, and therefore of our subsequent interval of active living. So that's why we fail to relate death and sleep. In sleep, only the thread of energy which is anchored in the brain is withdrawn. And when this happens, well, the man becomes unconscious to his physical surroundings. But by this, it is meant that his consciousness is focused elsewhere. His attention is no longer directed towards things tangible and physical, but is turned upon another world of being and being centered in another body. So the thread of consciousness is withdrawn, but the thread of life is still intact. But at death, it is literally the withdrawal from the heart and from the head of these two streams of energy, producing therefore complete loss of consciousness and disintegration of the body. So death differs from sleep in that both streams of energy are withdrawn and the house is empty. But in 900 cases out of 1,000, the brain consciousness during the dying process is there, with a full consciousness of what's going on around the departing soul. But there is a complete paralysis of the will to express and complete inability to generate the energy which will indicate aliveness. So when silence and understanding will rule the sick room, then the departing soul can take possession of its instruments with clarity until the very last minute, and it can make due preparation for its departure. So when death takes place and the life thread is gathered up by the soul and withdrawn from the heart and the head, and from thence back to the soul body, it carries with it the life of each chakra in the body. They all gather up. The life force gathers up to the heart and then to the head. And therefore the body dies and disintegrates and no longer forms a coherent, conscious, living whole. So now let's study the steps in the dying process. What exactly happens during that period of transition? Okay, so the soul on his own plane decides to end his life cycle and to withdraw his energy. A vibration runs along the nadis. The nadis is the etheric nervous system. So they respond to the word of the soul. They react to the pull of the soul. And then they start organizing themselves for abstraction. The glands then release a substance in the bloodstream, affecting the heart, where the life thread is anchored. This substance also affects the brain, where the thread of consciousness is anchored, therefore causing a loss of consciousness. A psychic tremor loosens and breaks the connection between the nadis and the nervous system, hence detaching the etheric body from the dense physical body. Then there's another pause. The loosening process advances painlessly and smoothly, and it starts in the eyes. The eyes become blank. There's no life there. Then the loosened etheric body begins to gather itself around the point of exit. The dense physical body begins to respond then to the attractive pull of the physical elemental, the spirit of the earth. And it is to this reservoir of involutionary and material life that the substance of all forms is restored. Then there is another pause. The physical elemental fights to regain control of the etheric body, and this battle can last for days and weeks. But when death, however, is inevitable, the pause at this point will be exceedingly brief, sometimes only a matter of seconds. The physical elemental then has lost its hold, and the etheric body awaits the final tug from the soul, acting under the law of attraction. The etheric body then emerges from the physical body at the chosen point of exit. The etheric body gradually dissipates. An analogy here is just very much like atoms that break up, molecules that break up into atoms. And once the dispersal of the etheric components is done, the process of restitution is over. The man in his subtle vehicles is ready then for the next process, the elimination of these bodies. So as the greater life absorbs the lesser life, it is true of the human form as it reacts to the call of the soul to return its principle to the soul via the Sutratma, and to return as consciousness to its registering source. A very quick summary of what we've been talking about. And one last summary here is that the discharge and the directed and focused will is so magnetic in its quality that it draws to itself the life of the other centers, therefore bringing dissolution of the form and the release of life. But at death, once the word of return is uttered, the consciousness aspect, the quality nature, the light, and the energy of the incarnating man are withdrawn into the etheric body. The life principle withdraws from the heart. There follows a brilliant and flaring up of pure electric light. The body of light finally breaks all contacts with the dense physical, focuses for a short period in the etheric body, and then disappears. And the act of restitution is accomplished. What are the exits at death? For the underdeveloped, the solar polarized people, infants or animals, the exit is the solar plexus. For the aspirants, men of goodwill, the kindly, well-meaning man or woman who is a kind citizen, an intelligent friend, and a philanthropic worker, the exit is the heart chakra. And for disciples and initiates and the mental types, it's the head chakra, which becomes the exit. And now let's consider consciousness immediately after death. For the average citizen, death is just a continuance of the living process in his consciousness and is a carrying forward of the interests and tendencies of the life. Now, his consciousness and his sense of awareness are the same and unaltered, and we have to remember that. His consciousness is exactly the same. He doesn't sense much difference, is very well taken care of, and is often unaware that he's passed through the episode of death. But for the aspirant, death is an immediate entrance into a sphere of service and expression which he is very well accustomed and which he at once recognizes as nothing new. In his sleeping hours, he has developed a field of service and of learning. So now he is simply functioning in it in the entire 24 hours, talking, of course, in terms of physical plane time, instead of his usual few hours of earthly sleep. But in the case of the highly developed human being, we often find a sense of prevision as to the death period. And this is because of the soul contact, the awareness of the wishes of the soul. It even sometimes involves a knowledge of the very day of death, coupled to a preservation of self-determination right up to the final moment of withdrawal. But in the case of initiates, it is much more than that. There is an intelligent understanding of the law of attraction, and this enables the person making the transition to transit and to withdraw consciously and in full awareness out of his physical body and to then function on the astral plane. And this involves the preservation of continuity of consciousness so that no hiatus occurs between the sense of awareness on the physical plane and that of the after-death state. The man knows himself to be as he was before, though without an apparatus where he can contact the physical plane. He remains aware of the states of feelings and thoughts of those he loves, though he cannot perceive or contact the physical vehicle. He can communicate with them on the astral plane or telepathically through the mind if they and he are in rapport, but communication that involves the use of the 5 physical centers are out of his reach. And it is useful to remember here that astrally and mentally the interplay can be closer and more sensitive than ever before, for he is freed of the handicap of the physical body. I will reread that sentence because it's a very important sentence, a thought from DK. Astrally and mentally, the interplay can be closer and more sensitive than ever before, for he is freed of the handicap of the physical body. So the person feels and receives the thoughts from us down here much more sensitively than if he was in his physical body. And that's very important to remember. So to sum up, the inner man is fully conscious. The physical brain and the swirl of etheric forces are no longer present. A man on the inner plane is not only as conscious of himself as an individual with his own plans and life and affairs as he was on the physical plane, but he is also conscious in the very same manner of the surrounding states of consciousness. And his experience is far richer and fuller than he ever knew when in incarnation. So what would be the activities of the departed after transition? Immediately after death, and particularly if cremation has taken place, DK tells us, the man in his astral body is as much aware and alert to his physical and to his environment as he was upon the physical plane when alive. So this involves a clarity of perception unknown to the average man whilst in physical incarnation. Time no longer exists, because time is really the impact of sequential events on the brain. And no brain, so time doesn't exist. Then there ensues a moment of direct soul contact. The man standing in his astral body sees the experience of his life, of his past incarnation, just spread before him like a map. He records a sense of timelessness. When soul contact eventuates, he becomes aware of the future, for prediction is an asset of the soul consciousness. So then, past, present, and future are seen as one. And at this point, the man isolates the three factors in his past life which will condition his future incarnation. And these three seeds are related to the three permanent atoms. The first seed will determine his future physical environment. The second seed will determine his next etheric body and which chakra will be the most active. And the third seed will determine his next astral body. And it is this third seed which, through the forces that it attracts, brings the man again into relation with those he previously loved or with whom he had close contact. The familiar and the loved will still remain the familiar and the loved, because the relation has been closely established over many incarnations. And now there's a very, very important thought from DK here. The group idea governs subjectively all incarnations. The reincarnated man is brought into incarnation not only through his own desire for physical plane experience, but also under group impulse and in line with a group karma as well as with his own. So we really need to emphasize this point, that we incarnate in groups. And here DK is dealing with the average man, not with the advanced human being, disciple or initiates. Once this experience completed, the man will be attracted to those comprised of his third seed and will re-establish the relation. And the relation once again established, if those that he seeks have not yet passed on, then the man will act as he would on earth in the company of his intimates and according to his temperament and point in evolution. Many people discover themselves upon the astral plane clothed in a shell of astral matter and committed to a period of elimination within the astral plane. But only disciples and initiates who live mostly in their minds find themselves after death immediately upon the mental plane. And the sentient substance which constitutes the astral plane still forms a barrier in the path of the soul seeking liberation. So that astral plane still holds the soul prisoner. And this is the case for the vast majority of people. So these 4 activities that we mentioned earlier covered varying periods of time. And from the angle of the men below, from the physical men, there is no time that's recognized. What? Okay, start again. Because there is no time on the astral plane. So these activities then will take varying periods of time. Gradually the lure and glamour of either high or low order gradually wears off. And the man enters then into the stage where he knows, because the mind is now more incisive and dominating, that he's ready for the second death, for the elimination of his astral body. Now, the elimination of the mental body by the disciple. The man, focused now in his mental body, has 2 things to accomplish. 1, to dissolve and to get rid of any astral sediment which may be discoloring his translucent mental body. And this he does by calling in increased light from the soul. And 2, to destroy his mental body through the use of certain words of power which is communicated to him via the ashram of his master. And these words of power bringing such soul power that they produce such an expansion of consciousness within the mental body that the mental body is broken up and no longer constitutes a barrier to the inner man. He can now stand free, a free son of mind, within the ashram of his master, and shall no more go out. So the conclusion to this section of Death and Consciousness, that the consciousness remains the same, whether in physical incarnation or out of incarnation. Consciousness doesn't die because the soul lives on. And that development can be carried on with even greater ease than when limited and conditioned by the brain consciousness. In other words, we keep on learning, we keep on working on the inner plane. And we keep on growing. Death and healing. The healer must bear in mind that his task is either to heal under karmic law or to aid in the processes of dissolution, therefore bringing about a higher form of healing. So death for the healer is a higher form of healing. Why is that? Because the soul is free. The healer helps the soul to free itself from his prison. Healing groups and individual healers will find necessary at times to confront their patients with the fact of death. And DK recommends, even the Master KH, who apparently said that it was necessary to interject the theme of death into conversations with other seekers for truth, into their thinking, into their discussions with one another, and in particular with those they seek to heal. It won't be easy, but it must not be done in a precipitated manner. It must be done with tact and with sensitivity. But it's a subject not to be avoided or evaded. And the last section of this presentation is cremation. Cremation is basically the dispersal of the etheric atoms. And fire brings about the release in a few hours instead of a few days. By the use of fire, all forms are dissolved. The quicker the human vehicle is destroyed, the quicker is its hold upon the withdrawing soul broken. In case of the underdeveloped person, when his body is buried, the etheric body can linger for a long time in the neighborhood of his outer disintegrating shell, because the pull of the soul is not potent and the material aspect is. But in the case of the advanced person, and therefore somebody who is detaching his thinking from the physical plane, the dissolution of the etheric body can be exceedingly rapid. And once this is accomplished, the process restitution is over. The man is freed, temporarily at least, from all reaction to the attractive pull of physical matter. Law 2 stipulates that the three basic traits from which all diseases stem are cancer, TB, and syphilis. These traits, to which humanity is prone, are actually found in the soil, and their presence is largely due to the burial down the ages of millions of corpses. So therefore, by the increased use of the processes of cremation, this condition will steadily improve. And gradually and very gradually, these taints will die out. So really, cremation purifies the soil. So therefore, DK recommends that there is as much propaganda as possible for the use of cremation. And not the present method of burial instead. Cremation returns the life of the lunar lords more rapidly to the central reservoir of life than any other method. For our God is a consuming fire, and all fires have affinity with a central fire. So our concluding remarks, what is DK's hope? Death is all around us at this time. The demand of the human spirit upon this matter has reached a crisis of potency, especially now with the war in Ukraine. It is evoking the inevitable response from hierarchy. So it is also my hope that students will do something of major importance to help in bringing in the light upon the processes of death which humanity is today demanding. What can we do to spread with efficiency the teachings on death from the age's wisdom? And I will close with a poem from Rumi, the Sufi mystic. When my coffin is being taken out, you must never think I am missing this world. When you see my corpse is being carried, don't cry for my leaving. I'm not leaving. I'm arriving at eternal love. When you leave me in the grave, don't say goodbye. Remember, a grave is only a curtain for the paradise behind. You'll only see me descending into a grave. Now, watch me rise. How can there be an end when the sun sets or the moon goes? It looks like the end. It seems like a sunset, but in reality, it is a dawn. When the grave locks you up, that is when your soul is freed. When for the last time you close your mouth, your words and soul will belong to the world of no place and no time.